is that the American people believe that Donald Trump's deportation efforts have been completely and totally out of control, unacceptable, and un-American. That's the reality of what Donald Trump has unleashed on law-abiding immigrant communities all across America. And the American people are rejecting it, which is why Donald Trump is also underwater in terms of public approval on immigration. Now, we believe, as Democrats broadly, that we need a strong and a secure border consistent with our history and experience as a nation anchored in the rule of law. Donald Trump doesn't believe in the rule of law, and neither do his sycophants who serve in Congress. We fail to understand that we're a separate and co-equal branch of government, not a wholly owned subsidiary of the Trump cartel, because that's how they behave.
Listen to what you just heard, because this is where the entire fascist mythology collapses in on itself. And here is exactly why this moment matters more than almost anything you will witness in American politics this week. Because Hakeem Jeffries just delivered an absolute masterclass in moral clarity, while simultaneously exposing the most insidious bad faith trap that conservatives have been setting for Democrats on immigration. And the beautiful thing is that he didn't even flinch when they tried to spring it. Trump's approval on immigration has plummeted by 10 points since March, and 6 in 10 Americans now disapprove of his job performance. And the polling data emerging this very week confirms what Jeffries stated with such unflinching precision when he said the American people are rejecting Trump's deportation machine, because the truth that conservatives cannot stomach, the entire narrative about immigration, has been exposed as the cruel performative theater it always was, and the public is watching in horror as the Trump administration has pushed immigrant detention to all-time highs and indiscriminately raided city after city, demanding 3,000 arrests per day, because Stephen Miller literally called a meeting in May, demanding 1 million deportations. And when you understand that level of the bureaucratic sadism as policy, you begin to see why Jeffries can stand there and call out Trump's contempt for the rule of law without ever having to apologize for the so-called radicalism of his own party. Because here is the trap they wanted to set, and you need to understand the mechanics of it to appreciate how Jeffries dismantled it before our eyes. The right wing wants desperately to force every Democrat to either disavow the grassroots energy of the Abolish ICE movement from 2018 or be painted as extremists who want open borders and chaos and lawlessness flooding into suburban America. This is the classic conservative move where they take the most passionate moral statement from the left and demand that every single Democrat either embrace it fully in a way that can be clipped for attack ads or publicly humiliate their own base by rejecting it. And the genius of what Jeffries does here is that he refuses to play that game entirely. He doesn't say abolish ICE, and he doesn't condemn those who do, because Democrats are now calling for an end to what they've coined secret police carrying out kidnappings while emphasizing the need for a secure border and support for deportations targeting criminals, but saying today's immigration efforts are shrouded in secrecy and lack accountability, which is a rhetorically sophisticated reframing that allows the party to maintain both its moral principles and its political viability in an environment where Californians' support is waning for Trump's harshest immigration enforcement policies, and where small-town rebellions are meeting deportation raids with 1,000 cuts as working-class white America refuses to serve as obedient foot soldiers for someone else's crusade. And when Jeffries talks about Trump not believing in the rule of law, you have to sit with how devastating that accusation actually is, because what he is articulating is not some abstract philosophical point about constitutional theory, but rather a concrete indictment of an administration that has weaponized immigration enforcement to aggressively target students in a manner wildly inconsistent with the Constitution, and has arrested and detained several lawful permanent residents and students who are in this country legally without producing evidence of a crime, and has repeatedly and illegally arrested and detained American citizens and lawful permanent residents without due process while raiding churches and schools and unleashing masked ICE agents on law-abiding communities, which is not hyperbole or partisan exaggeration, but documented reality that even conservative judges have had to halt in multiple jurisdictions. The rule of law means something specific in our constitutional system, and it means that executive power is bounded by due process, and it means that law enforcement cannot simply round up people based on what they look like, or where they work, or whether they attend the wrong church. And when the Supreme Court signed off on what has become known as a Kavanaugh stop, allowing agents to stop someone based on whether they seem undocumented, including considering their race, we crossed a threshold into state-sanctioned racial profiling that should horrify anyone who claims to care about American values and constitutional government. But wait, because we need to talk about the polling that just dropped this week that completely vindicates what Jeffries is saying and demolishes the conservative narrative that Trump's immigration crackdown is popular, and that Democrats are on the wrong side of public opinion. Trump's approval on handling immigration has dropped from 49% in March to just 39% now, representing a catastrophic collapse in support for what was supposed to be his signature issue and the issue that swept him back into power. Recent polling shows even a small majority of Republicans are losing support for the harshest immigration enforcement practices, while 61% of California voters now say they want the prison system to stop directly handing immigrants over to ICE for deportation. There is bipartisan support for ensuring that immigrants facing deportation receive due process, including ones with criminal records. This is the political earthquake that conservatives cannot explain away, because it turns out that when Americans actually see what mass deportation looks like in practice, when they see ICE supplemented by tens of thousands of agents arresting immigrants in courthouses at their check-ins or green card interviews, and at their homes, churches, and schools, when they witness the reality of people going through a process that takes 10 to 20 years, and then at the very end when they are about to become naturalized citizens being told to get out of line, or families waiting forever for green card interviews, either being rejected or the person getting detained and put through deportation proceeding, the American people look at that and say, this is not who we are, and this is not what we voted for. Now let me tell you what is really happening here beneath the surface of this viral clip, because this is about far more than immigration policy, and far more than one Democratic leader defending his position against Republican attacks. What we are witnessing is the last gasp of an authoritarian project that thought it could use state violence against vulnerable populations as a tool of political mobilization and social control, and what Jeffries is articulating when he calls Republicans sycophants and a wholly owned subsidiary of the Trump cartel is the recognition that the contemporary Republican Party has abandoned any pretense of being a separate co-equal branch of government with independent constitutional responsibilities, and has instead transformed itself into an enforcement mechanism for Trumpian strongman politics. This is Gramsci's concept of hegemony breaking down in real time, because the cultural and ideological dominance that conservatives thought they had established around immigration as an issue is crumbling. Ordinary people find common cause with those they were told to blame for their economic woes, threatening to upend the narrative that forgotten America will forever serve as obedient foot soldiers for someone else's crusade. And when about 135 people gather in Boone, North Carolina, a small Appalachian college town, not known as a hotbed of leftist protest, holding signs, reading Nazis were just following orders too, and time to melt the ice, you are seeing the geographic and demographic realignment of American politics that should terrify everyone invested in white nationalist restorationism. Here is what makes Jeffries' statement so powerful, and why conservatives are so desperately trying to force him to disavow parts of his own coalition. He is drawing a clear moral line between supporting robust border enforcement, which he explicitly states Democrats believe in, and supporting the kind of lawless cruelty that has characterized Trump's approach to immigration. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez made abolishing ICE one of her top campaign issues in 2018, and has reasserted that position since Trump took office in January, while Tom Homan threatened maybe she's going to be in trouble, and the White House posted a whole article on Ocasio-Cortez's call for elimination of ICE on its official webpage, because they are so certain this is a political winner for them, and yet, as Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders hold massive rallies around the country, abolition hasn't come up, and Ocasio-Cortez's official online store sells just one abolish ICE item that is sold out and no longer shipping, because Democrats have learned something crucial about political communication, which is that you don't have to use your opponent's framing or accept their terms of debate in order to maintain your principles and mobilize your base. Texas Representative Kassar, who endorsed abolish ICE as an Austin City Council member in 2018, now says he has changed, and that progressive sloganeering of Trump's first term backfired, and that we should be talking about our issues in a way that the broadest number of people can agree with, which is not an abandonment of the underlying critique of ICE as a rogue law enforcement agency, but rather a recognition that political movements need to meet people where they are, and build coalitions broad enough to actually win power and implement change. And this brings us to the most explosive revelation in what Jeffries said, which is his accusation that Trump and his Republican enablers have created a cartel, and understand what that word means and why it is so deliberately chosen, because a cartel is an organization that operates outside the bounds of legitimate governance, that uses violence and intimidation to maintain control, that answers to no authority except its own internal logic of power accumulation, And when you look at DHS announcing more than 2.5 million illegal aliens leaving the United States with more than 605,000 deportations since January, and when you understand that most of the decrease seems to be coming not from deportations, but from people choosing to leave, and according to administration estimates, self-deportation is 4 times more frequent than compelled deportation, though the government is holding a record number of immigrants and many volunteer to leave just so they can get out of detention, you begin to see how this administration has created an atmosphere of terror, so pervasive that people are fleeing the country, not because they have been ordered to leave through due process of law, but because they cannot survive in the police state that America has become for immigrant communities. This is not immigration enforcement. This is ethnic cleansing through administrative pressure and social violence, and the fact that the U.S. government offers a $1,000 stipend to people who self-deport using an app, but people say, "No way, I don't trust it," because they worry about legal penalties, and that the app might track them, or the people they associate with, tells you everything about how immigrant communities experience this administration, not as a legitimate government enforcing legitimate laws, but as an occupying force that cannot be trusted and must be fled. But let me take you even deeper into the ideological architecture of what is happening here, because when Jeffries invokes the rule of law, he is making an argument that goes back to the Enlightenment foundations of liberal democracy itself, which is the principle that law must be general in its application, knowable in advance, and administered impartially, without regard to the identity of the persons subject to it. This is Kant. This is Rawls. This is the basic social contract theory that says government legitimacy derives from the consent of the governed and the protection of fundamental rights, and what Trump has done is embrace what Carl Schmitt, the Nazi legal theorist, called decisionism, which is the idea that sovereignty consists in the power to decide on the exception to suspend normal legal procedures in the name of emergency, and to designate certain populations as outside the protection of law. Trump has put his whole government toward mass deportation, with one of the most visible aspects being a playbook that is beginning to become standardized in city after city, a Border Patrol and ICE urban terror playbook, and the playbook includes Border Patrol, ICE, and other feds going through areas where they think immigrants are living and working and arresting or pulling over anyone they think looks undocumented, which is the operational definition of arbitrary power unmoored from legal constraints. And when Border Patrol conducted an aggressive raid in California farm country, smashing car windows and rounding up people who looked like farm workers outside a Home Depot and at a gas station where many of them were eating breakfast, and many turned out to be U.S. citizens or green card holders, while others got swiftly deported without a hearing, that is not law enforcement, that is state terrorism against racialized populations. And this is why the right wing is so desperate to make this about abolish ICE, and about democratic extremism, because they cannot defend what is actually happening on the merits. They cannot justify the cruelty and lawlessness and constitutional violations on their own terms, so they need to change the subject to whether Democrats are sufficiently moderate and responsible and committed to border security. But Jeffries won't let them do it because he stakes out the position that Democrats broadly believe we need a strong and secure border, consistent with our history and experience as a nation, anchored in the rule of law, and then immediately pivots to the Trump administration's failures to uphold those principles. And this is exactly the rhetorical move that frustrates conservatives because it refuses to cede the ground of law and order and national sovereignty to them, while also maintaining a fierce critique of how those principles are being violated in practice. Trump and House Republican enablers have weaponized immigration enforcement to aggressively target students in a manner wildly inconsistent with the Constitution, and have arrested and detained several lawful permanent residents and students who are in this country legally without producing evidence of a crime, and courts must continue to halt this overreach where no legal basis exists, which is not an argument against immigration enforcement per se, but an argument about what legitimate immigration enforcement must look like in a constitutional democracy that respects human rights and due process. Now watch what happens when we zoom out and look at the broader context of resistance that is emerging across the country, because this is where the real story of American politics in 2025 is being written, and it is a story that the mainstream media is largely missing because they are so focused on the horse race and the partisan positioning that they cannot see the grassroots mobilization that is fundamentally reshaping the terrain of possibility. Mayors and local officials aren't just criticizing ICE raids, they're making life harder for federal law enforcement while being careful not to go over the line, and cities are finding ways to push back on unwanted immigration enforcement, and this has put local leaders directly at odds with Trump's mass deportation campaign because of the law-passed litigation and public sentiment. Los Angeles County officials approved an emergency declaration that will cover living expenses for people who miss work because they fear immigration raids, and it started accepting requests for aid in December, while San Francisco's local district attorney hatched a plan to charge ICE agents for violating state laws as they carried out arrests such as violating the statewide ban on agents wearing masks and possible excessive force. This is federalism being weaponized for progressive ends. This is Sanctuary Cities 2.0, learning from the first Trump administration and preparing more sophisticated legal and administrative resistance, and despite intensified criminalization of asylum seekers and immigrants, and immigrant detention at all-time highs and indiscriminate raids, city after city, the Trump administration remains well behind their mass deportation goals in large part due to state and local efforts to protect immigrant communities and limit cooperation with ICE Border Patrol and other federal agencies, which means the resistance is working, and the authoritarian project is failing to achieve its objectives, even as it inflicts tremendous human suffering. But let me bring this back to the political implications of what Jeffries is doing in this moment, because he is not just defending his party's record or pushing back against Republican attacks. He is articulating a vision of democratic politics that can actually win elections and build power, while also maintaining fidelity to progressive values and racial justice imperatives. The trap that Democrats fell into during much of the 2010s was allowing themselves to be portrayed as caring more about immigrants than about American citizens, as prioritizing cultural issues over economic concerns, as being beholden to activist pressure rather than responsive to working-class anxieties, and what happened was Republicans were able to use immigration as a wedge issue to peel off working-class voters, particularly white voters in the industrial Midwest, who felt economically insecure and culturally displaced. But something has shifted. It was easy enough for politicians to paint resistance to immigration raids as the province of big city liberals or communities of color, but what happens when predominantly white working-class towns start throwing sand in the gears of the deportation machine? And the answer is that the entire political calculus changes, because suddenly immigration enforcement is not an abstract issue about border security and national sovereignty. It is a concrete issue about your neighbors being dragged out of their homes, and your coworker disappearing from the factory floor, and your children's classmates being ripped away from their families. And this is what conservatives cannot process, which is that there is clear concern about the current administration's approach to immigration enforcement, and strong support for due process, and growing frustration with treating people inhumanely in our immigration system, cutting across partisan and demographic lines, because it turns out that most Americans, when confronted with the actual human reality of mass deportation, do not like what they see regardless of what they told pollsters about wanting stricter border security in the abstract. In Harlan County, Kentucky, a storied epicenter of the Appalachian labor wars, a convoy of black SUVs rolled into town, and armed agents in tactical gear stormed 2 Mexican restaurants, and at first the operation was framed as a drug bust, but despite being carried out by DEA agents, it was an immigration raid, and of the people arrested and jailed, their cases were listed as immigration without a single drug-related offense. And you know what happened next, because Harlan County has a long, proud history of resistance to abusive authority, and the people there recognize tyranny when they see it, regardless of whether it comes from coal companies or from federal immigration agents. This is class consciousness emerging in real time. This is working people across racial lines, recognizing their common interests against state repression, and this is exactly what the ruling class has always feared most, which is why they work so hard to divide us along lines of race and nationality and citizenship status. So when Jeffries says Trump is underwater on immigration, he is not engaging in wishful thinking or partisan spin. He is stating an empirical fact that is confirmed by approval of Trump's handling of the economy and immigration being down about 10 points since March, and by June 2025 surveys finding that 54% of Americans disapprove of ICE's increased workplace raids, and 57% of voters disapprove of how ICE is enforcing immigration laws, with 64% disapproving of deporting people to third countries, and 54% thinking ICE has gone too far. And these numbers are devastating for an administration that staked everything on the proposition that Americans wanted maximum cruelty toward immigrants, and that Democrats would be punished for insufficient enthusiasm for deportation. What we are learning instead is that there is a massive gap between what people say they want when asked abstract questions about border security versus what they are willing to tolerate when they see the concrete human consequences of mass deportation policies, and Democrats who were terrified of this issue are starting to find their footing as they realize the public is with them when they emphasize due process and human dignity and constitutional principles rather than trying to out-hawk Republicans on enforcement. And now we have to talk about what Jeffries means when he says this is un-American, because that is a loaded term that can be deployed in reactionary ways to police dissent and enforce conformity, but in this context, he is making a historically grounded argument about American identity and values that deserves to be taken seriously. The United States is a nation built on immigration, a country that has always been defined by successive waves of newcomers who came here seeking opportunity and freedom, and who built the economic and cultural infrastructure that makes this country what it is. And Trump has said specifically that the U.S. should welcome more people from countries like Norway, Denmark, and Switzerland, and his entire anti-immigrant platform, and his war on immigrants, and his mass deportation agenda is all to lead to making America white again, and that is what it comes down to, according to immigration advocates, who see this with absolute clarity. This is not about law enforcement. This is not about national security. This is not about protecting American workers. This is about a white nationalist project to reverse demographic change and restore a mythical version of America that only ever existed in the reactionary imagination. And when you understand that, as the underlying ideology, everything else makes sense. The cruelty, the lawlessness, the targeting of legal immigrants alongside undocumented immigrants, the attacks on birthright citizenship, the travel bans, based on religion and nationality, all of it is in service of an ethno-nationalist vision that is fundamentally incompatible with constitutional democracy and multiracial pluralism. But here is where it gets really interesting, and where Jeffries' critique becomes most cutting, because when he accuses Republicans of being a wholly owned subsidiary of the Trump cartel, he is identifying something that goes beyond normal partisan politics and speaks to the authoritarian capture of an entire political party. There is a robust political science literature on how democratic backsliding happens, and one of the key mechanisms is the transformation of opposition parties from independent power centers with their own institutional interests into vassals of an authoritarian leader who demands absolute loyalty and punishes any dissent. In the Trump administration has swelled the number of deals between ICE and local law enforcement to more than 1,000 agreements across the country, which has helped fuel immigration arrests and feed the pipeline for deportations, which shows how federal executive power is being extended through corrupt bargains with compliant local officials who are incentivized to participate in the deportation regime. This is how authoritarianism consolidates power, not through a single coup, but through the gradual erosion of checks and balances and the co-optation of institutions that are supposed to provide oversight. And this is what Jeffries is calling out when he says we are a separate and co-equal branch of government, not a wholly owned subsidiary, because Republicans in Congress have abdicated their constitutional responsibility to serve as a check on executive power and have instead become enablers of executive overreach. And we need to understand that this is part of a broader assault on democratic institutions and the rule of law that extends far beyond immigration policy, because the Trump administration has repeatedly broken the law and skirted court orders while deporting American citizens, including children, without due process protections guaranteed by the Constitution, and members of Congress have a constitutional responsibility to serve as a check on the out-of-control policy of the executive branch, including conducting oversight wherever and whenever it is needed. And when masked agents physically accosted two congresswomen who were trying to conduct oversight of detention facilities, you are looking at open contempt for congressional authority and constitutional separation of powers. This is not normal. This is not partisan hardball. This is authoritarian governance, where the executive branch claims unlimited power to do whatever it wants to whomever it wants, without meaningful oversight or accountability. And the fact that the Trump administration has repeatedly and unlawfully blocked members of Congress from carrying out oversight of potential abuses in the immigration detention system, and Democratic members of Congress are fighting back with a first-of-its-kind lawsuit, asserting their constitutional responsibility to serve as a check and balance on the executive branch, tells you how far we have drifted from democratic norms and constitutional governance. So here is what I want you to take away from this moment, and why this clip matters so much more than just another partisan food fight on cable news. Hakeem Jeffries just demonstrated how Democrats can talk about immigration in a way that is both morally compelling and politically effective, that doesn't require them to either abandon their principles or alienate their base, that stakes out clear ground on the rule of law and due process and human dignity, while also affirming the legitimacy of border enforcement and national sovereignty. He is threading a needle that many people said was impossible to thread, and he is doing it at a moment when border security remains Trump's best issue with 50% approval, but overall, 6 in 10 have a negative opinion of Trump's handling of the presidency, which means there is space for a democratic message that meets people where they are on security concerns, while also calling out the cruelty and lawlessness of Trump's approach. And most importantly, he is refusing to let Republicans set the terms of debate, refusing to accept their framing, refusing to disavow the energy and passion of the progressive base that has been fighting this fight for years, and instead he is flipping the script and putting them on the defensive for their contempt for the Constitution and for the rule of law and for basic human decency. This is how you build a political movement that can actually win power and transform society. You don't do it by abandoning your principles or moderating your message into meaningless mush. You do it by articulating those principles in ways that connect with people's lived experiences and moral intuitions, and by exposing the moral bankruptcy of your opponents, and by building coalitions that are broad enough to govern while also deep enough to sustain themselves through periods of repression and backlash. New York City Mayor-elect Zohran Mamdani said he told Trump in their recent meeting that the raids are cruel and inhumane. Then he won his election on an explicitly progressive immigration platform, and this tells you something crucial about where the Democratic base is, and where the energy of the party is, and where the future of progressive politics is going to be built. The resistance to Trump's immigration policies was not some fringe movement of radical activists. It is a mass mobilization that includes elected officials and community organizations and labor unions and faith communities and ordinary people who look at what is happening and say this is not who we are and this is not what we will accept. And that is why conservatives are so desperate to make this about abolish ICE and about democratic extremism, because they know that if the debate is actually about Trump's policies and Trump's record and Trump's contempt for the rule of law, they lose and they lose badly, and the polling proves it, the grassroots resistance proves it, and the fact that the Department of Homeland Security posted on social media days after starting new operations in Minneapolis and New Orleans, saying to the violent rioters and sanctuary politicians, "You will not stop us," proves it, because that is the rhetoric of an administration that knows it is losing the argument and is doubling down on force and intimidation because it has no other cards to play. This is what defensive authoritarianism looks like. This is what happens when a regime realizes that it cannot win legitimacy through persuasion and consent, and so it falls back on coercion and violence, and the demonization of opponents. And the thing about that strategy is that it can work for a while, but it is ultimately unsustainable because you cannot govern a complex modern democracy through fear alone. You need some baseline of popular legitimacy and institutional support, and both of those are eroding for Trump on immigration faster than anyone predicted. So when you watch this clip again, and you see Hakeem Jeffries calmly and methodically dismantling the Republican narrative on immigration, refusing to be trapped by their bad faith framing and asserting with absolute moral clarity that Trump does not believe in the rule of law, what you are watching is a Democratic Party that has finally figured out how to talk about this issue in a way that is both principled and effective, and that is very, very dangerous for Republicans, because immigration was supposed to be their trump card. It was supposed to be the issue that guaranteed them electoral dominance for a generation, and instead it is becoming a millstone around their necks as the American people wake up to the reality of what mass deportation actually means and reject it in increasingly large numbers. The authoritarian project is failing, the resistance is growing, the political terrain is shifting, and Democrats who were running scared on immigration 6 months ago are now going on offense because they have finally realized that when you stand up for the rule of law and human dignity and constitutional principles, the American people are with you and the polls prove it, and the grassroots energy proves it, and most importantly, the lived experience of millions of Americans who are seeing their neighbors and coworkers, community members being terrorized by federal agents proves it beyond any doubt. This is the moment. This is the pivot. This is where the tide turns on immigration politics in America, and Hakeem Jeffries just showed us how it is done.